Good morning, everybody. And I'm here today with Pat Kinsella from Proof, one of the latest membership organizations in Kantara, and with Kay Shopard, who many of you will know already as our executive director. We really wanted to talk to Pat and the team from Proof, particularly as a new member, because we wanted to know a little bit more about what's going on in your world, Pat, but also what has driven the decision to become a member of Kantara. Where do you see the value, and what do you want to get out of that membership that perhaps other organizations could learn from? So I suppose first question is just tell us a little bit about Proof, what you're up to, where you're going, and what you see as the big why, if you like, in your world.
Yeah, thrilled to be here. Thrilled to be a member of Kantara as well, and to tell our story. So, Pat, as you said, a lot of people know my company as Notarize. That's how we actually
Mm.
started, and we spent 7 or 8 years as Notarize. And what we did is we went out and digitized how you notarize documents. And if you think about that, that's about proving who you are, about proving what you've done, and about creating a record that is tamper-proof. And so as a company, we've been out really digitizing industries. And so the auto industry, the mortgage industry, wealth management, retirement, medical care, I could go on and on. And we've realized that our mandate is really much bigger than notarizations. That core problem, who are you? What have you done? How can I trust it? Is really our mission and our mandate as a company. And especially with everything that's going on with generative AI and deep fakes, this concept of can I trust who I'm interacting with? Can I trust the records that my business or that
Mm.
I'm personally relying upon is really critically important. And so we think it's timely. And so we've got a lot going on these days, is the short answer to your question.
So, in terms of the decision to join Kantara at this point in time, can we ask what was it that drove you to join this year?
It's a great question. So we have a long history in dealing with, regulations, legislation, unblocking industry. And so in our core business of Notarize, we similarly worked with an association out of the mortgage bankers and land title called NISMO. And what we saw was how important it was when people came together, they agreed on standards, everyone understood, what the rules of the game were. It really unlocked the market for us. And so as we've expanded as a company, we've similarly looked for, how can we get that stamp of approval in these industries? And the truth is that if you're talking to someone in the mortgage business or the auto business or small business lending needs IL2 e-signature, they have literally no idea what that is. You might as well tell them you're visiting from space, and they need to do backflips. So it's a lot of, how do I know what this is? How can I trust you, right? How do I know that
Mm.
you're operating at the highest standards? And so for us, it was really critical to find someone that was impartial, where we could say to them instead, look, this is an actual concept, right? This is a whole ecosystem. There are third-party validators. We've subjected ourselves to that. And then in a contract, we can represent that we comply, that we're approved. It makes it a hell of a lot easier than having to explain this ourselves. So we're really appreciative for everything Kantara has done to set that standard.
Okay. Okay, that's a good chance to bring you in on some of the new stuff that's coming out with the NIST guidelines that are obviously being updated, and kind of feedback we're gathering on that at the moment. Where do you see all of that going, Kay? And what are the opportunities for working more with organizations that are members of our working groups and of Kantara at a wider level?
Well, thanks, Karen. That's kind of a big question, but let me just say, I really appreciate what you're saying, Pat, about the focus that Kantara brings to the assurance program and to the need for so many industries to understand what does IAL2 or AAL2, what do those terms mean? And why also is that important to them? Why does that make a difference? And Kantara is a relatively small nonprofit organization, and it has not always been good at getting its message out in the world. And so we're thrilled to have organizations like you and people like you who really understand what that value is and what that value is to multiple markets and why it's really critical that we do this. I do, and I appreciate your comment about you wanted someone impartial. And I think that's one of the beauties of Kantara in two ways. One, because we are a certification body. In fact, we're in the final stages of being ISO approved internationally as an accreditation body. And but at the same time, because of our nonprofit status in the US, that really requires us to be technology agnostic. We're not selling anything. We're not selling solutions or promoting solutions. And we're not saying everyone has to solve these issues a certain way. But we are saying, as you point out, that there are standards and that those have been established beyond Kantara. And we really try to make them practical and applicable and make it so that not only can organizations like yours, who really obviously do a good job in this world of all the kinds of things, you are who you say you are, all of that. It's not a simple answer. But then the other piece of that is the purchasers, the relying parties, the buyers. They need to understand what those standards are as well and know to be looking for it. And many of the purchasers that I work with have talked about the fact that what Kantara does with its assurance program, it really keeps them from having to do a lot of extra work because we're doing that testing. So I think it's wonderful and it makes a lot of sense for why you would start there with us. But as you know, Kantar also has a lot of work groups. And I heard you raise the deep fakes, which is obviously a work
Mm.
group that we have that's sort of trying to address those issues. What are some of the things that you see on the horizon that you think we need to try to tackle?
Yeah, it's a really challenging time, I would just say. And I think we should all acknowledge that, the world just went remote. You look at all the statistics about our personal lives, our professional lives. And so businesses are now interacting with their customers predominantly remotely, but also with their employees. And so what we're seeing is things like account takeover, major corporations having to shut out every employee and re-enroll them because accounts have been compromised. Everyone saw the $25 million wire out of the finance department with the deepfake. And so these things are happening. And I think they're happening more than people appreciate. Everyone should know that. It's not just some scary international, crime ring. It's someone's son, it's their family member who might be taking money out of their retirement account or borrowing against their home. It's sort of every variety. We've seen about 8 minutes is all it takes to generate a deep fake. It's really terrifying. To me, I think the thing we need to really consider is that the sort of brute force of impersonation attacks is around the corner. And if you think about the security world, this idea that someone might submit 100,000 fraudulent requests is coming given how easy it is now to impersonate and to prevent deepfakes. I find what's so interesting, though, by your earlier comment, is I genuinely believe that the solutions exist. And I genuinely believe that organizations like NIST and I believe Kantara and the groups that we have, the frameworks exist for identity verification, for, cryptographic signatures, for, access control. And really what we need to do is come together and tie these together. Something that strikes me all the time is, and I talk to, CISOs or other people, and I say, look, imagine in your tech stack, if you allowed people to submit instructions that weren't signed from the source. They'd say, I would never, ever in 1,000 years let someone do that, right? You know who they are, you've got TLS, you've got all sorts of standards in order to ensure, security. But in their normal business, they do. They allow people to come in and out and submit documents and effectively submit instructions into their business that are unsigned. And so to me, if we take the security world, if we take the IT world, the identity world, these policies exist and we can solve them. That's a conversation that requires a lot of people coming together, right? And that's what I really
Mhm.
like about the discussions at Kantara and other places.
Mhm. Well, I think that that's really true. And well, I appreciate that you are very optimistic and positive about the fact that the solutions are out there. And what do you think are there ways that Kantara could help facilitate that coming together that you just described when it could be a pretty broad audience? How can we make that happen more effectively?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I thought it was interesting, and I I may have shared this story with you one-on-one, but I had the chance to testify in a congressional hearing earlier this year in the fall, and it was about artificial intelligence and deep fakes, and there are some really challenging issues that we have to grapple with as a society. I think a lot of what NIST has been taking on has to do with equity and access. Not everyone has a great camera, a great device, a newly issued driver's license. We can't leave them behind. Model transparency and credit and underwriting. There's some really challenging issues. There are some issues, though, that we can all agree, and I think, circle around solving them. Security is one of them, right? And I think that that audience of people, to pull together and say, how can we provide assurance of the people that we're actually transacting with? What as a society, should the rules be? Can I impersonate you without your permission? That's a pretty specific thing that we can resolve. And so I think that's part of the conversation. And I think separately, one of the things I also really like about Kantara is that there are some people out there pushing things that don't quite work, right? And there's vendors who say, 100% accuracy, this, you can do this, you can do that. The truth is that it really requires a lot of different solutions. There's a lot of different threats that can come together, to cause these problems. And so to me, it really needs to mimic, again, the security market and to drive that conversation forward.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think you're right about the security market and about needing to drive that forward. But, the other thing that we see in Kantara is kind of a balance with privacy advocates and privacy advocates who worry that we are going to do all kinds of things to violate people's privacy in the name of security. How do we sort of balance that? How do we solve that and maintain those privacy rights still?
Yeah, privacy is a challenging issue, and I think we should acknowledge the current circumstance. And first off, it's just my bona fides on this. I mean, I actually helped draft and sign the Internet Users Bill of Rights in 2007. We as a company have said we'll never sell consumer data. So I think we're on the right side of this issue, but I acknowledge it's super, super challenging. I think a couple things. One, the current state of the world, the pressure that regulators are putting on businesses is forcing them to collect more and more and more personal information. So now as a consumer, every organization you want to interact with, you have to give them everything. And that's ludicrous. And it means that we're reliant as a society on every organization having the best security standards. And so to me, I look at things like payment networks, right? You can use a credit card, you can use a token, right? In order to transact, those systems now have, temporary or single use tokens that they issue consumers. You don't go around giving everyone your bank information in order to conduct commerce. And so my opinion, and this of course is self-serving, is some companies need to step forward, hold themselves to much higher standards, and allow people to transact without sharing their personal information with everyone. And I go back to the beginnings of Notarize and our, regulatory push. Different legislators would push back on us, and I would say, look, let's just take a step back. First principles. What are we trying to do? We're trying to prove who someone is, prove what they've done, create a record. Can't we do better than a little book, right? And when we got people into that mindset, we designed a better system. And I would say today, from a privacy standpoint, let's acknowledge again that everyone giving all of their information to everyone they interact with is not the right starting place. And that's why I'm so passionate about, credentials, tokenized identity, things like that. I think they're a real game changer.
Well, the things that you've raised, I mean, those are great points. But the other thing that I also hear people talking a lot about is interoperability. And I think that's another layer of complication, if you will. Like you're saying, all of these different, whatever vendors, services are requiring you have to give all this information to everyone. How could we somehow take some of the principles that you've just suggested and adopted and make that interoperable as well? Is that possible?
I think it's possible. It's again an area that I'm passionate about. You got to remember being the online notary guy to start. I spent years out there and I had, 10 years of people saying, isn't blockchain going to get rid of the notary? Isn't blockchain going to get rid of, title insurance? And my counter to them was, the current system works pretty well. And if you think about the mortgage market, it is highly interoperable. You know, anyone can issue a mortgage and sell it into the secondary market. There's data standards or something that's called MERS. It's a registry. So my 2 cents is that I think the same thing is happening in identity, where people are trying to replace the entire system, you know, and I don't see that, you know, happening at least overnight. That's why we've made our bet on PKI. And our view is that the internet itself is built on, you know, public key encryption. And if we can tap into those systems and allow companies to take, you know, advantage of there being someone strongly enrolled with a PKI certificate, it allows people to move forward without having to replace their entire tech stack. Our view also is that's one of the reasons why we like PDF, right? And what we've seen is we've had a lot of customers, they do something digital. They might do blockchain-based HELOCs. But the truth is they have counterparties that have, you know, audit obligations and things of that nature. And so they may be doing something, you know, fancy with blockchain, but they're typically generating a PDF receipt of the transaction that's auditable that their relying parties can keep. And so we need to figure out bridge solutions, in my opinion, that support companies where they are today and the advancement of security. Our bet's on PKI. But look, you know, if it's blockchain tomorrow, we'll do blockchain. And my view, that's just implementation and it's just technology. And the other thing I would say is there needs to be more value. And something that we constantly hear is that, yes, I care about fraud, but at a certain point, fraud is the cost of doing business, and you can't reduce my conversion rate. And so I think the identity market really takes a step forward when we can offer that assurance and actually increase conversion rate, not add friction to transactions. And what we hear from a lot of our customers is they've said, look, you've helped us digitize my customer experience, right? I'm collecting forms and data faster with fewer errors. Now help me digitize my decision, right? To actually send someone that money. And that's so much of where we're focused as a company now. Richer fraud signals, higher levels of assurance, cryptographic signatures, so that they can just decide to send someone the money.
So it's interesting that you say, you know, their interest in sort of digitizing their decision, because another thing that I wanted to ask you about is we've talked a lot about sort of consumer facing identity, but more and more we're getting input about identities that are not human, right? And that there is a need for an assurance about an identity that isn't necessarily a person, whether it's an organization, and maybe it's a decision, maybe, you know, there's other ways. How does that impact what we're talking about now?
Yeah, I agree deeply with the problem, and I think the solution is similar, right? Which is again, you know, the security and cryptography industries have solutions for this. They have key enrollment, you know, ceremonies. They have all of these things where you prove who someone is. There's been a huge investment in things like, you know, business entity verification. There's lots of companies that are playing in that space. So in my opinion, you know, if the objective is certainty, right? You want to be certain of who you're doing business with. Can you trust them? Can you make decisions faster based on that trust? It is a two-way street, right? It's consumers submitting content to businesses, but it's also businesses submitting content to consumers. If you think about wire fraud in real estate, it's predominantly people pretending to be your realtor. Well, if you knew that your realtor actually was enrolled and verified, that their business was validated, their content was signed, it would solve for this problem. I'm excited about C2PA as a standard. This has, you know, been promulgated by Adobe and, you know, principally Adobe, but Google and Microsoft and other people are on board. And this is, you know, content watermarking. So these solutions, I should say, exist. When I talk to someone who is from sort of core platform tech, what I say to them is what we figured out is how to do consumer grade certificate enrollment at scale. And that's the real thing I think that we've figured out how to do. And I think the implications are pretty broad.
Wow. Well, I think that, well, number one, I'm very encouraged, if nothing else, than by how positive you are about all this. And the
I mean, I'm
fact that you're,
terrified, don't get me wrong.
well,
Yeah.
but I think it has to be a balance. I am the same way. I feel I'm a little terrified as well. And sometimes the more I know that, the more frightening it is. On the other hand, I'm encouraged because of people like you in the industry, right? I mean, that's what we have to have. We have to have that energy and that passion and that willingness to roll up your sleeves and figure out how do we make this work. And I like to think that that's also the way that Kantara approaches most things. Um, in that same vein, I mean, the challenges are there, and the challenges in some ways feel like they're growing. But with that, sort of the opportunities are growing too, I think. And I, we are thrilled to have you and your organization to be part of Kantara because that's really we need what you can bring, and we need your leadership and your thought leadership in all of this, which is just really
Yeah,
a huge thing.
I would say, and the other side of just being encouraged is, a lot of industry trade groups are really wrapping their head around these problems too. The retirement industry through Spark and something called LIMRA has a fraud share program. And, we've seen identity move out of compliance into risk. We think that's a really positive sign. I think, a disservice that KYC AML did to the identity industry is they made this a check the box compliance thing. And it's very funny to me because KYC AML is about protecting a bank from you, right? But once you have given them your money, the retirement industry has $30 trillion they need to protect for consumers. And I think we're seeing this play out where we're seeing Citi get sued by the New York AG saying you didn't do enough. We're seeing Zelle, refund almost $1 billion because you didn't do enough. Well, what is enough, right? And that's where these conversations at the policy, both industry and government, vendors, the relying parties have to come together and agree on what we're going to do. So I see the conversation happening. That's why I'm so encouraged. People are looking for solutions. Companies like us have to prove, as they say, the proof is in the pudding. So,
Yes.
yes.
So I've actually got a question for both of you, because I'm listening to this. It's really heartening, but I also wonder what's the role of the consumer in all of this. We talk a lot about the different standards. Even the word identity as an industry has taken really something, I think, away from what is essentially a very human industry. It's a hugely human consumer-led focus for everything we do. And I know we've got two work groups in Kantara alone that look at this, whether it's underserved populations, whether it's the equity and inclusion. Are we seeing enough from consumers and consumer groups of making people aware of the role that they have to play in this by demanding the right sort of standards, demanding that their data is properly, looked after and adhered to? What are your thoughts around that? Pat first.
Yeah, I don't think consumers care enough, frankly. I think it's on us to, again, give them a compelling value proposition for why they should care. I would say the flip side of the coin is, in our research, consumers right now are very concerned that people can pretend to be them, right? And so the ability to reclaim your identity, to have the ability to prove what you actually did, and if that's how you live your life with, certainty of the actions you take, the content that you create, it makes it easy to say, I didn't create that, right? So I think that's a world that we want to try to move people, to. The other thing is I think a lot about the dynamics of a network, and I think about why does a credit card work? And to me, it's like you get an alert that said someone charged $72 on your American Express. You're like, what?
Yeah.
You report that. And so I think from an engagement model, we've got to figure out how to get people to be more engaged, to be alerted, to have a strong sense of when people are pretending to be them across, various categories so that they can stand up and represent themselves. The other thing I would just say, though, is that, we recently signed a contract with a very large financial services company in the retirement space. At the end of the day, they sell their services into employers. Those employers are very concerned about how they're going to protect their customers' money, right? So that is an end user value. So we are seeing companies really start to recognize that if they can tell an identity security story, it is helping them win business. right? And I think when that plays out more and more and it becomes table stakes, how do you secure that when someone's requesting funds,
Mm.
you have certainty of who they are, right? How do you deal with impersonation and deep fakes? I think the whole market moves forward. And so we're starting to see that, and that's really encouraging.
Okay. Oh, that's good to know. And Kay, anything there, in the work that we're doing? I know NIST Rev 4 will look a lot more at the whole issues around inclusion, but is there anything more that, you've been talking quite a lot about the whole issues on inclusion and diversity recently. Is there more to add to that we could be doing to make consumers aware of what actually happens with their identity or their ID, in behind the scenes?
Well, it's a little harder for Kantara, I think, to
Mm,
get information across to consumers. We're a little bit more
mm,
removed, as a certification body, that we don't have the same interaction.
no,
Um,
no.
but that said, I think that the more that we can try to look at, some of the things, for example, that we've been looking at in the organization is what are the metrics that we should be
Mhm,
looking at, which is obviously something in an assurance program we want to be able to assess
mm,
how well are solutions working and what are the metrics that we ought to focus on. I think one of the issues that we also have concerns about is that for those who have more difficulty with accessibility, which could be for a
mm,
variety of reasons. They don't have the right technology. It could be other things, disabilities of any kind, or whatever it might be, socioeconomic status. There's all kinds of reasons. Um, how do we set standards where we can be sure that the most vulnerable are also protected?
mm,
Because I think sometimes solutions have diluted the measures that they have in place to mitigate fraud because they don't work for some of those populations. And the
mhm,
problem with that is that we've just made the most vulnerable even more vulnerable. And so I
mhm,
think for Kantara, trying to figure out how can we ensure that we keep the same level of standards and that we are using appropriate metrics, and that even that we're defining terms in the same way so that we're all on the same page. I think those are some of the challenges that we have. And maybe someday we will be in a position to do more things to educate consumers. I'm not sure we're quite there yet,
no,
but that said, we recognize that they're kind of the foundation
mm,
of identity systems, right? So you can't ignore that. Um, so hopefully some of these other things that we are trying to focus on now will be able to really um, be useful and support the industry in trying to address these issues.
yeah.
Yeah,
I
if I
think the
could,
role of, yeah, sorry, I was going to say the
oh
role of
no.
Kantara as an influencer, sorry, will be very, very key in that and influencing the influencers. We may be several step removed, but we have a role. Sorry, Pat, yeah.
I was going to say, I'm also passionate about the accessibility and equity issues. And I think we need to figure out how to brand those so that people care more broadly, honestly. And so, we did some surveys and it showed, for example, that people in rural communities had less access to notaries in urban communities. And so, one, you can reach more people in a digital context. But two, standard of process, standard of care, transparency, being certain that people are getting, the same experience, regardless. But from the business community standpoint, I think it's really simple to say, look, don't you want to serve everybody? Isn't everybody a larger market than fewer people? But I do worry that these issues don't get sufficient daylight and they're frankly kind of seen as like whatever. And I agree with what you said, Kay. Like as we design a better, faster, more efficient world for people, everyone needs to be able to avail themselves of those services. So
Mm,
whatever we can do to help on those issues.
Thanks, Pat. I agree. I have some concerns that, like, I think you mentioned labeling, like we haven't found a good way to articulate some of these issues. Because I think if we could do that in a better way, they would get in some ways more notice. And people would recognize the significance of what we're talking about. I recently spoke at a conference and I was on a panel, mostly with people from the banking industry, talking about accessibility. And what was interesting is that those who are product developers talked about that it's really important to think about that on the front end, right? As you're making solutions, you want to think about it instead of trying to go back and fix something later. But one of the things that struck me was one of the presenters said, what we've discovered is that when we try to develop for a wider audience, for those with accessibility issues, we actually ended up making solutions that were easier and better to use for everyone. So they were kind of like, it was a lot of work on the front end, but the result was really better service to all of our customers, not just this one little segment, that we might have been thinking about. And I think a lot of times that gets lost. And we think instead we're reinventing the wheel and, this is a big burden and, I'm pushing a boulder up a hill. And I really appreciated this particular bank saying, but not for nothing, turns out we made a better user experience for all of our customers.
Well, and I think a
So
lot of people in tech don't appreciate that, especially in banking, the consequences are very real. If they're proven that they're giving, like I've had some customers who say, wow, you're saving us, so much money, we should give it a discount for people to go digital. Well, suddenly, if that's something that not everyone can avail themselves of, then they have an issue with unequal access or preference by demographics and things like that. And so those are very real issues that these industries have to deal with. And so I think, for everyone in the industry to understand the sort of the stakes, right, the seriousness to address these issues. But again, I mean, all people represents the biggest market, right? It's pretty simple, right? So that's where we're very focused on. And then also, I would just say that, like, as a consumer, we shouldn't have to live like this, right? It's just also just, pardon my French, but a shitty experience to travel the internet and constantly put your information in over and over and over again, or to have your identity stolen, or I could go on and on. And so I think, when there's a solution, consumers will rally around it. So
that's true too.
Cool. Thank you both so much. I mean, I guess just as a way of a wrap up, really, Pat, you've joined membership now. I know you've got several of your colleagues involved in some of the work groups and the wider community. But is there anything that you would say as an organization that you could give advice to other member organizations or other organizations you're thinking about joining? How to get the best value out of what is effectively an investment. And it's a significant investment. We recognize that. We want to make sure that people are getting absolutely the best out of it all. So any words of advice?
yeah, I would just simply say that it is a self-selecting group of people who takes these issues seriously and who wants to work with other companies to solve it. So it's a very friendly group. And also, these issues are very challenging, so no one has all the answers. I believe companies are sort of born out of their experience. And so for me, coming from the notary market, I've got my experience. Other people have theirs. So more voices, the better. And if there's anyone out there listening, I think, who's from some of the industries that are impacted, I would especially encourage them to participate, so it's not all sort of the technology and identity vendors. We get more of the impacted industry involved, and we're going to solve this. So you might as well grab a seat and be a part of it. As they say, better to be at the table than on the menu. So
Right.
Love
Very
it.
good.
That's great. Well, thank you both very much for your time today. I appreciate you're both very busy people, but these kind of interviews are just great for us, both at Kantara, but I think actually for the wider community that we serve, because it gives them a little bit of an insight into what goes on in the life of our members and what they're thinking. So thank you, Pat, particularly for your time. Thanks, Kay. And we'll see you all again soon.
thank you.